It was a crisp autumn morning in St. Mary Mead, the sort that brought out the deeper hues of the hedgerows and made the air taste faintly of apples. Miss Marple, wrapped in a neatly buttoned wool cardigan the shade of lavender heather, was pruning her rose bushes with the delicate precision of a surgeon. Beside her, perched primly on a folding chair, sat Mrs. Hartnell, puffing with mild indignation. "Morals," Mrs. Hartnell was saying, "have utterly collapsed. One has only to read the headlines." Miss Marple nodded with her usual gentle agreement, although her thoughts wandered from scandalous modern novels to the stubborn aphid troubling her peace rose. "The world," she said mildly, "has always been a mixture of wickedness and virtue, I find. Only the presentation changes." Mrs. Hartnell snorted. "Presentation indeed. Why, I saw young Doris Blunt wearing rouge at church last Sunday." "Rouge, Jane?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Doris is 17. One must allow for some folly in youth. It is the persistent folly of the older generation that is more alarming." A silence settled between them, broken only by the chirp of a robin and the gentle snip of Miss Marple's shears. There was something very comforting about the routine of roses, gossip, and moral decline in St. Mary Mead. But as always, beneath the village's soft exterior, the whisper of something darker waited, unseen, but not unnoticed. By the time Miss Marple had set aside her secateurs and Mrs. Hartnell had shuffled off to inquire about her nephew's rheumatism, word had already reached the bakery. As was customary, the vicarage cook overheard it while selecting seed cake, and within the hour it had trickled into the drawing rooms and parlors of St. Mary Mead like a particularly juicy jam. "Edmund Latimer is having people down this weekend," Miss Marple's maid Florence informed her over tea, her voice tinged with curiosity and barely concealed disapproval. "A proper gathering, at Fernley House no less." Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. "Fernley? I had thought it quite empty since Mrs. Latimer passed on." "Oh, he's moved in proper now," Florence replied. "Got guests coming, friends from London, and his sister too. Someone saw bottles of wine delivered and a fresh crate of oysters." "Oysters in October," murmured Miss Marple. "Quite indulgent." Florence leaned closer. "They say he's invited a married lady, Margaret Denby, the one what used to visit with her husband years back. And you know how folks talk then." Miss Marple did indeed know. Not that she approved of idle gossip, but one could often learn a great deal from it. Fernley House had long been the seat of genteel scandal, and Edmund Latimer, newly returned from the city with a trail of debts and dalliances, was just the sort to rekindle its reputation. Miss Marple, without saying so, suspected the weekend would end with more than just indigestion. It was just after matins on Monday morning that the news broke in earnest. Miss Marple, stepping out of the village shop with a small bag of currants, was intercepted by young Jimmy Fells, the butcher's delivery boy, who was visibly out of breath and oddly pale. "You've heard, ma'am," he blurted with the sort of urgency that comes only with truly sensational news. "About Mr. Latimer?" Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "No, Jimmy. Has something happened?" "Dead," he said in a low, awe-struck whisper. "Found him just this morning, slumped over in his study. Branded himself into a grave, so they say." Miss Marple's expression did not change, though her fingers tightened slightly on her shopping bag. "How unfortunate, and how sudden." "Dr. Greaves was called, said it was his heart, but—" Jimmy hesitated, eyes wide. "I saw him yesterday evening, through the study window. He'd poured a drink, just sitting there. But when they found him, the glass hadn't been touched, they said. Not a drop. Curious, said Miss Marple softly. By midday the entire village had heard of Edmund Latimer's untimely demise. Some muttered about stress and city living. Others recalled the family history, fragile hearts, a tendency to overindulge. But Miss Marple remained quiet, save for one observation to the grocer's wife. It is odd, don't you think, how people so rarely die peacefully in lovely houses like Fernley. There's always something just a little off. And indeed, in the hush that followed Edmund Latimer's death, there was a tremor beneath the calm, a sense that something had been left undone, unspoken, or perhaps deliberately concealed. By Tuesday morning, St. Mary Mead had catalogued the key players at Fernley with the precision of a parish ledger. Miss Marple, without appearing to pry, had gathered a surprisingly complete picture of the weekend's guests and of Edmund Latimer's complicated life. First and foremost, there was Vivian Latimer, Edmund's only surviving sibling, a tall, angular woman with severe eyes and the look of someone who had never learned to laugh without restraint. She had remained unmarried, stayed behind to tend to their ailing mother while Edmund sought his fortune, or at least the illusion of it, in London. It was whispered that Vivian considered Fernley her rightful home and had never forgiven Edmund for inheriting it. Then there were the Denbys. Margaret, a former school friend of Vivian's, and once the toast of county dances, now faded, but still elegant, and her husband, Charles Denby, a man with the sort of quiet presence that made one forget he was in the room until he spoke, and then remember him, rather uneasily. Dr. Lionel Greaves, the local physician, had attended to the Latimers for decades. He was well liked, or at least respected, though Miss Marple had always found him rather too brisk in manner. It was he who had signed the death certificate. Lastly, there was Eliza Crowthorne, the housekeeper. She had been with the Latimers for over 30 years, so long in fact that some villagers confused her for a relation, stern, private, and deeply loyal. Or at least, she had been. Lately, something about her had shifted. Miss Marple had noticed it the last time they passed in the greengrocer's, the hesitation before a greeting, the unfocused stare. A household full of connections, resentments, and long memories. Exactly the sort in which murder, when it came, was rarely a stranger. It was Wednesday afternoon when Miss Marple returned to the grocer's for a fresh loaf, and found herself served by Billy Cray, the delivery boy, a lanky youth with knobbly knees and a fondness for unnecessary detail. He was recounting his Sunday route to the grocer's wife, seemingly unaware of the impact his words might have. "I saw Mr. Latimer that evening," he said, grinning as he adjusted his cap. "Through the study window, you know. Had the fire going and all. He'd just poured himself a brandy. Nice fat one it was. Only odd thing was, he didn't touch it. Just sat there, staring at it." The grocer's wife clucked her tongue. "Maybe he was thinking. He always looked like the brooding sort to me." But Miss Marple had paused by the biscuit tin, her expression unreadable. "You're quite certain he poured the drink himself?" Billy nodded, eager now. "Oh yes, ma'am. I saw him lift the decanter and all. Bit careless, really. Sloshed it right up the side." "Did he drink from it at all?" "No, ma'am. Just sat looking. Looked a bit pale, truth be told." Miss Marple thanked him and moved on. But the detail lingered in her mind. If the glass had been poured and left untouched, how curious that the doctor's report made no mention of it. More curious still was the smell of almonds, faint but unmistakable, that Miss Marple had detected in the grocer's air, though she suspected it had nothing to do with marzipan. It was Thursday morning when Miss Marple made her way to Fernley House, the autumn leaves crunching faintly beneath her sensible shoes. The visit was made, as always, under the gentlest pretense, a condolence call. In St. Mary Mead, such calls were not merely social obligation, but quiet performances of sympathy, laced with observation. And if anyone knew how to blend the two, it was Jane Marple. Vivian Latimer received her in the drawing-room, a sombre, high-ceilinged affair hung with family portraits, and a lingering sense of old furniture never quite aired. Miss Marple's condolences were offered with sincerity and a gentle clasp of hands. "Thank you," Vivian said, her voice carefully composed. "It's been rather a shock." She did not look particularly shocked, Miss Marple noted. Worn, yes, but not hollowed by grief. Her dark dress was perfectly tailored, her hair set immaculately. There was a rigidity to her posture that suggested long-held resentments, more than fresh sorrow. "You have guests still staying?" Miss Marple inquired mildly. Vivian's mouth tightened. "The Denbys remain for a few more days. It's all been rather inconvenient. Margaret is quite distraught." Miss Marple offered a sympathetic murmur. In the corner, the housekeeper, Eliza Crowthorne, entered to offer tea. Her expression was unreadable, her eyes avoiding Vivian's. The conversation drifted politely, yet tension crackled beneath it, like dry twigs underfoot. Miss Marple noted how Vivian's fingers clenched slightly whenever her brother's name was mentioned, and how the housekeeper's silence held the weight of unspoken things. It was the sort of house where one did not speak truths directly, but where, if one listened carefully, they practically shouted through the silences. Following the tea, Miss Marple asked, with the subtlest hint of hesitation, if she might pay her respects in the study where Edmund had been found. Vivian agreed with a flicker of discomfort, and Eliza led her to the room. The study was a masculine chamber. Dark wood, leather-bound books, the lingering scent of cigar smoke, and something faintly chemical, an echo perhaps of whatever poison had not yet been named. Miss Marple moved slowly, respectfully. Her eyes, however, missed nothing. On the desk sat a brandy decanter, and beside it, a crystal glass, refilled now, but she suspected the setting had not changed since the body had been removed. The chair, stiff-backed and too upright, seemed unwelcoming, but it was the glass that drew her eye. It gleamed, untouched, its surface clean but for a faint halo of blurred fingerprints around the rim, oddly concentrated. Miss Marple bent slightly, feigning an elderly squint. "Such fine glass," she murmured. "One rarely sees such clarity these days." Eliza hovered awkwardly by the door. "Mr. Latimer preferred it." Miss Marple nodded, then allowed her hand to rest near the chair. "And he was found just here?" "Yes, ma'am, just there, slumped over the blotter." Eliza spoke flatly, and Miss Marple noticed her hands, twisted in the apron, slightly reddened and fidgeting. It was only a glass, but Miss Marple had seen too many murderers undone by less. The question was not merely who had poured it, but who had made certain it remained untouched. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple found herself in the company of Vivian once more, this time in the conservatory, where the air held the faint chill of oncoming winter and the scent of overwintering chrysanthemums. Vivian had offered more tea, though her manner was mechanical, and her eyes were distant. "It was rather unexpected," Miss Marple said gently, watching her companion over the rim of her teacup. "He seemed so young for such sudden misfortune." Vivian gave a short laugh, the kind that comes with effort. "He drank too much, gambled too freely, and treated the house as though it were a hotel." Frankly, I was surprised he lasted this long. The words hung in the air a moment too long. You must miss him terribly, Miss Marple offered mildly. Vivian looked away. We were very different people, Miss Marple. I stayed here, nursed our mother through her illness, managed the affairs. Edmund was away, always away, and when he returned it was with debts and schemes and women who didn't know how to behave in a dining room. Miss Marple said nothing, simply nodded. He inherited Fernley. Vivian went on, her voice tight, only because he was a man. But he had no sense of legacy. If he'd sold it off brick by brick, I don't think he would have cared. But I cared. I always have. The bitterness was barely concealed now, curling like smoke from an unseen fire. Miss Marple, sipping slowly, watched the woman carefully. It was not grief she saw there. Not really. It was something colder, resentment that had fermented over years into something hard and sharp. And that, Miss Marple knew, could be far more dangerous than hate. Miss Marple had always maintained that women, when cornered by emotion or circumstance, revealed far more than they intended. And so she was not at all surprised when a casual visit to the village dressmaker brought with it more than lace and hemline chatter. Margaret Denby, said Mrs. Turner, flicking a thread from a bolt of muslin. Oh, she used to be the prettiest thing at county bowls. You'd never have thought she'd settle for someone like Charles. Always seemed to carry herself above him, if you take my meaning. Miss Marple smiled gently. She and Edmund Latimer were close once, I believe. Close. Mrs. Turner's eyebrows rose. There was talk, Miss Marple. Talk enough to fill the church twice over. And now, well, it said she was thinking of leaving Charles. Ran to Edmund for advice or something more. Later that day, Miss Marple encountered Margaret walking alone near the lane behind the church. Her eyes were red-rimmed and she offered only the briefest smile. I'm afraid this has all been terribly confusing. Margaret said, he was my friend. More than that once, perhaps. But it's over now. Was long over. Miss Marple only nodded, offering a tissue with quiet understanding. But she noted how Margaret's voice faltered on the word, once, and how she gripped the tiny pearl at her neckline, as though it held her past together. Affection, guilt, and possibly motive. Miss Marple had seen such things before, and they seldom ended quietly. If Margaret was cracked porcelain, Charles Denby was ironwork, cold, composed, and without a hint of rust. When Miss Marple found herself briefly alone with him at the Church Fete Committee's bake stall, he had volunteered to carry a crate of preserves. She seized the opportunity. Such a sad business, she said gently. Charles nodded curtly. Quite. You knew Edmund well? Well enough. He was a man of many appetites. There was no warmth in the reply. I imagine it's difficult. For your wife, I mean. She and Edmund were friends of long standing. Charles looked at her, not rudely, but with something close to scrutiny. My wife is easily swayed by sentiment. It doesn't trouble me. Of course not, Miss Marple murmured, though some men find it unsettling. Charles gave a tight smile. Mrs. Marple, I'm not the sort who gets unsettled. I deal in facts. Edmund is dead. Margaret is my wife. And gossip, however colorful, is only that. But his hands betrayed him. Though his tone was cool, his knuckles whitened where they gripped the box. And there was, behind his polite dismissal, something brittle. Miss Marple had seen such men before, men who bottled resentment until it soured. If Margaret had truly sought Edmund's comfort, or worse, his escape, It was not impossible that Charles had found out, and such men, when they act, seldom leave room for discussion. Dr. Lionel Greaves had always presented himself as a man of precision, sharp mustache, punctual house calls, and a tendency to speak in clipped, definitive phrases. But when Miss Marple visited him under the guise of inquiring after Florence's persistent neuralgia, his answers struck her as rehearsed. "Yes, poor fellow," he said briskly. "Heart gave out. Latimer was never in the best condition. Too much drink, not enough rest. I told him, you know. Years ago." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "So sudden, though. And so young. One wonders whether a post-mortem might have confirmed matters." Greaves stiffened. "Quite unnecessary. I saw the body myself. Cyanosis, labored breathing, classic signs. Nothing suspicious." She stirred her tea. "But you didn't see him alive that day?" "No," he said shortly. "But I've treated him often enough to know his state." Miss Marple's expression remained pleasant, but internally she mocked the defensiveness, the eagerness to dismiss any deeper inquiry, the absence of a second opinion. She asked gently, "And the glass beside him? He hadn't drunk from it?" The doctor blinked. Yes, I believe he had. Brandy, a regular habit." Miss Marple lowered her eyes. "I see." But she did not see. In fact, the more Greaves said, the less she believed him. Not that he had killed Edmund. No, she doubted he had that kind of boldness. But his desire to close the case swiftly, to avoid questions, suggested something deeper than mere professional pride. A mistake, perhaps, or a secret he could not afford to share. Eliza Crowthorne had served the Latimers for 33 years. That fact alone carried weight. But Miss Marple, who had once known a lady's maid who poisoned her mistress for denying her an annuity, did not believe in blind loyalty. She encountered Eliza dusting the entrance hall of Fernley, and paused to offer quiet words. "You must miss him terribly." Eliza's hands did not pause. He was a good employer. "A strange phrase," Miss Marple said softly. "Not quite affectionate." Eliza finally looked up. Her face was drawn, eyes shadowed with something more than grief. "He changed," she said. "In the last year. Treated people different. Spoke about selling the house. Said I'd had a good run, and that times were changing." Miss Marple said nothing. "I gave him my life," Eliza added quietly. "I missed my own mother's funeral for this house. But men like Mr. Latimer never remember that, do they?" She turned back to her dusting. Miss Marple walked away slowly. There was a finality to Eliza's voice, an undercurrent of betrayal, heavy with hurt. And betrayal, Miss Marple knew well, was a motive far older and more dangerous than greed. It was over tea with Reverend Lonsdale's wife that Miss Marple made her final observations of the day. The conversation drifted, as such chats often did, from parish concerns to recipe exchanges to the curious doings at Fernley House. "Oh, and didn't I hear that Margaret Denby went out walking quite late that night?" Mrs. Lonsdale mused. "Past the copse near the orchard path. Not like her." "And Charles?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Up late as well. Said he was reading. But no one saw him." From another visit to the greengrocer's wife, she learned of a quarrel between Edmund and Dr. Greaves weeks earlier, over some unpaid bill or perhaps something more personal. And from young Billy Cray, she heard of a valet tray that had disappeared. "It was always in the study, ma'am," he said. "Used to carry the brandy on it. But it weren't there when I saw the body." Piece by piece the fragments began to settle, her resentment buried beneath smiles, her broken loyalty, her glass untouched, a woman walking alone, and the faintest smell of almonds, like a ghost at the edge of memory. Miss Marple folded her knitting and smiled. There was still much to learn, but the pattern, as always, was beginning to emerge. Miss Marple had always believed that very little in a village truly escaped notice, especially smoke. So, when young Alice Braithwaite happened to mention, quite innocently, that she had seen Miss Vivian Latimer burning papers behind Fernley House, it did not take long for the gossip to ignite as well. She had the brazier going, Alice said, while adjusting carnations in a vase at the church. Quite early, too. Before breakfast, I think. Naturally, Miss Marple was curious. A few well-timed questions to the gardener yielded confirmation. Miss Latimer had indeed spent a half-hour in the rear garden that morning, feeding a thick bundle of papers into the flames with what appeared to be calm determination. It was a few days later when Miss Marple, in the course of a second condolence visit, remarked gently, "I do envy your ability to let things go, Miss Latimer. I saw your lovely little fire the other morning. Such a good way to clear out old papers." Vivian gave a brief smile, though her fingers twitched against a teacup. "Yes, old family letters. Sentimentality has its limits, Miss Marple." "How wise," Miss Marple murmured. "One can't always afford to keep the past lying about." Vivian said nothing, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of discomfort. Later, through a village acquaintance once employed at Fernley, Miss Marple learned the contents had indeed been old family letters, some written by their mother, others by Edmund during his school days. Harmless in themselves, but their destruction had felt purposeful, a cleansing perhaps, or something closer to erasure. And when a woman chooses fire over drawers, Miss Marple knew, it is not sentimentality she seeks to bury, but memory. The next afternoon Miss Marple returned to Fernley with a jar of quince jelly, her own making, though the gift was less about preserves and more about presents. She found Margaret Denby alone in the drawing-room, seated stiffly beneath the portrait of Edmund Latimer. It was a striking likeness, painted when he was 25, cocky, handsome, with the kind of charm that rarely aged well. Margaret stared at it with glistening eyes, her fingers wound tightly in the hem of her silk handkerchief. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said suddenly, voice cracking. "He wasn't perfect, you know. He could be cruel, careless with people's feelings, but he could be wonderful, too." Miss Marple sat beside her, offering the silence of someone who understood far more than she said. "I thought once that he might, but he didn't. He never intended to, and I knew that. I always knew. Still." Her voice faded. Miss Marple took her hand. "Sometimes, my dear, the heart mourns what the head has long since abandoned." Margaret gave a watery smile. "That's rather wise." "Only the accumulation of years," Miss Marple replied gently, "and perhaps too much exposure to human folly." But as they sat together, the older woman noticed how Margaret's gaze kept drifting, not toward the portrait but toward the corner table, where a decanter stood. There was grief in her expression, yes, but not fresh grief. Something older, sharper, regret perhaps, or guilt disguised as loss. And Miss Marple, who understood the subtleties of grief better than most, began to wonder just what Margaret had lost, and what she might have taken. It was while tidying the desk in Edmund's study, a task assigned to Eliza with silent disapproval from Vivian, that a small brown bottle came to light, wedged behind a sheaf of bills. The label, mostly intact, read, "Digitoxin, a potent heart medication." Miss Marple heard of its discovery through Florence, who had the habit of gleaning snippets from the grocer's sister, who helped at Fernley part-time. By the following morning, the information had reached her ears with remarkable clarity. A heart drug, Miss Marple murmured, during a conversation with Dr. Greaves at the vicarage garden sale. Rather strong, isn't it? Greaves blinked. Quite. One doesn't prescribe it casually. Why? I heard, she said lightly, that such a bottle was found in Mr. Latimer's study. Did you prescribe it? There was a pause, not long, but noticeable. No, he said at last. He wasn't my patient for anything cardiac-related. It may have been left by someone else, or a mistake. How strange, Miss Marple said with a smile. Edmund didn't strike me as the type to collect medicine for its aesthetic value. Later she made discreet inquiries through an old friend whose husband had once worked as a chemist. No prescription for digitoxin had been issued in Edmund's name in the past year. The presence of the bottle raised uncomfortable questions. Had Edmund been self-medicating for a condition no one knew about? Or had someone else placed it there, either as treatment or as misdirection? Miss Marple made a mental note. The heart is easily broken, but not always easily stopped. In houses such as Fernley, with their orderly routines and long-serving staff, items did not simply vanish, and yet the valet tray, customarily used to carry Mr. Latimer's nightly brandy, was nowhere to be found. Miss Marple first heard of its absence from Florence, who had it from the kitchen maid's cousin, who had overheard Eliza muttering about misplaced things to herself in the scullery. When Miss Marple, ever tactful, inquired of Eliza directly during her next visit, I always thought that handsome tray of yours was a fine piece of silver. One notices these things, you know. The housekeeper responded a shade too quickly. Oh, that old thing. It's been sent for polishing. Quite overdue. Indeed. I thought Edmund preferred it close at hand, his little ritual with the brandy every evening. Eliza's eyes flickered. Well, he did. But lately he'd grown careless, often forgot to ask for it at all. Miss Marple smiled politely, but her mind ticked over. A silver tray, even tarnished, would not be forgotten or discarded. And it was odd, very odd indeed, that it should disappear just after Edmund's death, especially when the glass found near his body appeared so curiously untouched. More than once Miss Marple had seen such objects vanish not by accident, but with quiet purpose, removed not to hide themselves, but to erase a truth someone hoped never to face. The puzzle of the brandy glass had lingered in Miss Marple's thoughts like an unresolved melody, one that refused to resolve into a final note. It was at Mrs. Price Ridley's whist afternoon that a new note was struck. Miss Marple, seated beside Mrs. Webb, the Denbys' charwoman, mentioned quite idly how strange it was that Mr. Latimer had been found with an untouched glass. Mrs. Webb, a woman of unshakable opinion and erratic memory, was unusually firm. Untouched? Oh no, he definitely poured himself one. That tray of his, always set beside the armchair. I saw it myself 2 days before. But the tray wasn't found. Course not. And it weren't the same glass either. That much I do remember. The one in the study now is from the drinks cabinet in the corner. The others were the good crystal, only used with the tray. Miss Marple offered no reaction beyond a small nod, but her pulse quickened slightly. Back home she thought it through again. Edmund had poured a brandy, likely placed it on his usual tray. That tray, and the original glass, had vanished. In its place, a new glass had been arranged by the time his body was discovered. The implication was simple and chilling. The scene had been staged. Someone, after Edmund's death, had deliberately removed the original drink and substituted another, an untouched one. The question was why? To make it seem he had died before he could drink, or to ensure no one suspected the drink itself had killed him. It was no longer merely about who had wanted Edmund dead, but who had taken the time to rewrite the moment of his death. It was during a chat with Daisy Underhill, the parlourmaid's niece, that another small but curious detail emerged. Daisy, full of romantic notions and easily impressed by the goings-on at grand houses, spoke eagerly when Miss Marple accidentally dropped her knitting near the gate, where Daisy waited for her cousin. "Oh yes, I saw someone, ma'am, near the study window that night. Must have been nearly midnight." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, retrieving her yarn. "And who was it?" "Well, it was Mr. Denby, Charles. I saw him crossing the hall, holding something. Might have been a scarf, though it looked bulky. I remember because he looked about, quite sharp-like, before slipping in." "Curious," Miss Marple said. "Did you tell anyone?" "No, ma'am. Thought he'd just forgotten something. But now, what with everything—" Later, Miss Marple casually mentioned the sighting to Charles Denby, who dismissed it with his usual precision. "Ah, yes," he said. "I had left my scarf in the study earlier. Realized it before turning in. Didn't wish to disturb anyone." "But at midnight?" Miss Marple asked gently. "A bit late for retrieving a scarf." Charles smiled thinly. "I'm afraid I don't keep quite the same hours as the rest of the house." It was a perfectly reasonable reply, on the surface. Yet it had that peculiar, rehearsed quality Miss Marple had heard too often over the years. A truth built atop a lie, something seen but not quite explained. She began to wonder what exactly Mr. Denby had carried with him that night, and whether it had truly been wool or silver. At the Women's Institute luncheon, Miss Marple sat in her usual spot near the window, a ball of soft gray yarn unraveling steadily in her lap. While others discussed the village raffle, she listened. She always listened. Across the table, Mrs. Hartnell was lamenting the modern trend of medical misdiagnosis. "In my day, a death was a death. Now they're always second-guessing the poor doctors." Mrs. Lonsdale chimed in. "Well, I heard Dr. Greaves was in such a hurry to sign the certificate. He didn't even examine the decanter." Miss Marple gave no sign of interest, but her fingers paused for the briefest moment on a pearl. From a nearby conversation she caught Margaret Denby's name. "Walking alone late at night she was," someone said. "By the orchard, they say. Strange behavior, what with her husband in the house. And then Vivian Latimer burned half the family papers, probably afraid someone would find something scandalous." Miss Marple smiled politely, sipping tea. But inside the threads were tightening. Her drink poured but never consumed. A missing tray. A housekeeper who felt betrayed. A woman full of old regrets. Her husband caught in a lie. A doctor too quick to diagnose. And a scent, so faint but unmistakable, of bitter almonds, barely clinging to memory. By the time her knitting reached the heel of the sock, Miss Marple had formed her theory. Not complete yet, but clearer with each stitch. Murder, when committed carefully, was rarely violent in appearance, but it always left a pattern, hidden beneath the ordinary, and Miss Marple was very good at spotting patterns. It was during an entirely ordinary conversation with Mr. Ellaby, the village baker, that Miss Marple's thoughts were suddenly and irrevocably disturbed. She had gone in for a bath bun and had commented quite cheerfully on the freshness of the loaves that morning. "Oh yes, Miss Marple." Mr. Ellaby replied, "and not a moment too soon. My wife's been cleaning the storeroom and the smell in there. Why, it was like almonds. Bitter ones. She says it was from some old flower gone off, but it fairly made my head turn." Miss Marple froze for only the briefest moment, then smiled lightly. "Bitter almonds, you say? How curious. Not a common scent. No, indeed," he said, wrapping her bun. "Made me think of that dreadful foreign liqueur my cousin brought back from Marseille." But Miss Marple was no longer listening. The scent of bitter almonds, a faint, elusive fragrance, unmistakable to anyone who had read widely in matters of criminal chemistry, as she had. It was the classic hallmark, indeed the only consistent olfactory clue, of cyanide. And that scent, she now recalled with chilling clarity, had hovered near Edmund Latimer's study on the day she had visited. Faint, almost ghostly, but present. It was not the smell of brandy or cigar smoke or even polish. It had been something else, something far more dangerous. Miss Marple, who had known women who poisoned with arsenic, and men who stabbed with words, felt the hairs rise slightly at the back of her neck. So it had been poison after all. And if poison, then not accident, nor heart failure, but murder, deliberate, precise, and cold. And now, she would need proof. Miss Marple had long ago cultivated the art of asking difficult things in the gentlest way. It was not a skill taught in school, but one acquired over years of village teas, quiet funerals, and knowing when to lower one's voice. Thus it was that she approached Dr. Bert Whistle, a former pupil of her late cousin, and now a rising pathologist at the county hospital. "I know it's highly irregular," she said over tea in his mother's garden, "but I wonder if you might consider something for me, discreetly." She explained her concerns, not directly accusing, of course, but suggesting that the original cause of death might not have been as natural as assumed. Bert Whistle, to his credit, took her seriously. He remembered her solving the affair of the arsenic sponge cake after all. With the blessing of the coroner and a quiet nudge from the chief constable, who had learned to trust Miss Marple's instincts with a respectful sigh, Edmund Latimer's body was exhumed and examined. The report, returned in a sealed envelope to Miss Marple 3 days later, was brief and chilling. Hydrogen cyanide. Clear traces found in the stomach and bloodstream. There was no evidence of ingestion through food, no trace in the lungs to suggest inhalation, which left only one logical conclusion. He had swallowed it, most likely in liquid form. Most likely, Miss Marple thought, in brandy. And yet the glass had been untouched, unless of course the original glass, the real glass, had been taken away. It was a small deception, but as Miss Marple well knew, small deceptions were often the most deadly. It was late afternoon when Miss Marple, under the guise of admiring autumn roses, returned to Fernley House with a polite request to Vivian Latimer. "You've always had the most glorious climbing varieties," she said. "Might I take a short stroll near the west trellis? I should like to compare them to my new dawns." Vivian, flustered and still weary from the ongoing inquiries, agreed at once. Eliza was instructed to fetch tea, leaving Miss Marple mercifully unaccompanied. The west side of the house was seldom visited. The rose trellis there was thick with tangled branches, many of them already turning crisp at the edges. Miss Marple's step was slow, her eyes not on the blooms but on the base of the ivy-covered wall. And then she saw it, half hidden beneath a tumble of drying leaves and bramble, a glint of silver. She crouched slowly and extracted it. A silver valet tray, tarnished but unmistakable. Beneath it, wrapped clumsily in an oilcloth, was a crystal brandy glass, its rim faintly stained. She brought it to her nose and drew in a breath. There it was again. Faint but present, the almond scent that confirmed everything. She did not touch the rim, only examined the faint lipstick mark at the edge, a smudge of crimson. She made a mental note of the shade. Not quite Margaret Denby's usual coral tone. Someone had carefully placed this here, not buried, but tucked away, just far enough to delay its discovery. Miss Marple smiled, not from triumph, but from certainty. The truth was buried, yes, but not very deeply. And now that she had the tray, she also had the turning point. The final pattern had begun to emerge. Miss Marple returned from Fernley that evening, with the unearthed glass wrapped carefully in a linen handkerchief and tucked discreetly in her knitting basket. Later, in the soft lamp-lit quiet of her parlor, she examined the faint smudge on the rim with a small magnifying glass she kept for embroidery. The color was distinct, a deep, unfashionable crimson, not the coral pink she had often seen on Margaret Denby's lips. Margaret, for all her romantic melancholy, had always chosen delicate shades, tones that whispered of wistfulness rather than passion. Even during the funeral, Miss Marple had noted her lipstick, pale rose, just touched with gloss, entirely in keeping with her modest aesthetic. And yet, here was proof, a kiss of color left behind on the very glass that had, almost certainly, held poison. If the lipstick did not match Margaret's, then whose did it match? She thought back, over tea, over church, over little errands and observed gestures, and the answer began to form in her mind. Her recollection not of glamour, but of change, subtle but deliberate. Someone who had, recently, shifted her habits. Someone who had always been invisible, until she no longer wished to be. And as Miss Marple looked again at the color, rich and old-fashioned in tone, she realized it was not the mark of a flirt or a coquette. It was a costume, worn by someone not to seduce, but to signal that they had finally had enough. It had been no more than a passing remark, one of those seemingly inconsequential things that nestled quietly in the mind, until their significance bloomed. Miss Marple had overheard it at the post office only a week earlier. "Eliza wearing lipstick," Mrs. Price Ridley had exclaimed, and read, of all things. I nearly dropped my stamps. At the time, Miss Marple had dismissed it as idle gossip, but now that remark returned with startling clarity. Eliza Crowthorne, housekeeper of 30 years, known for her unadorned austerity and iron-gray buns, had taken recently to applying lipstick, a deep crimson one, according to more than one surprised villager. It was wholly out of character. Eliza, whose idea of indulgence was a second spoonful of sugar. Eliza, who had scorned cosmetics for decades. Eliza, who had given her life to the Latimer family, without thanks, without comfort, and in the end, without reward. Miss Marple reflected on Eliza's recent quietness, her curt responses, her sudden desire to blend in less. It was not vanity, it was transformation, her rebellion perhaps, a signal that something within had shifted, hardened. And then there was the lipstick mark on the glass, matching not Margaret Denby's modern tones, but Eliza's new, defiant shade. Miss Marple, who had seen rage take many forms, quiet, cold, blistering beneath the surface, understood at last. Sometimes it was not the wild, jealous lover one needed to fear. It was the overlooked woman, standing in the background, whose loyalty had curdled into silence, and whose heartbreak had finally turned red. The last threads of the tapestry were coming together, and Miss Marple, seated by the fire, with her needles idle in her lap, began to review each one. Motive. Eliza Crowthorne had served the Latimus for over 3 decades. She had missed funerals, birthdays, and what small pleasures life had once offered in favor of duty. When Edmund inherited Fernley, she had stayed, though the tone of the house had changed, no longer a family refuge but a bachelor's playground. And when Eliza overheard his plan to sell Fernley, she must have realized what it meant, her displacement, her irrelevance. After so many years he had cast her aside, with the same carelessness one might discard an old umbrella. Miss Marple had seen what such betrayal could do to a proud heart, means. Eliza had access to every room, every routine. She knew how Edmund liked his brandy, exactly how much, when, and in what glass. She would have known precisely where to find the cyanide, a remnant perhaps from old gardening stores, or borrowed from a forgotten cupboard in the tool shed. She would have had time to slip it into his drink, wait until he was alone in the study, and then watch from the shadows. And when he collapsed, quietly, likely without a sound, she would have known what to do next. Remove the incriminating glass, take away the tray, replace it with a clean one, make it look as though he'd simply died before ever taking a sip. Opportunity. The household had been distracted. Margaret had been walking the orchard path, Charles lurking near the study under the guise of retrieving a scarf. There was enough bustle to mask Eliza's quiet movements, and no one would suspect her. No one ever did. But Miss Marple had. Slowly, stitch by stitch, she had followed the pattern, the tray hidden behind the roses, the lipstick that did not belong to the supposed lover, the motive built not on passion, but on principle, on a slow, simmering heartbreak that had curdled into resentment. And it had been Eliza, not in a moment of rage but in a moment of clarity, who had planned and executed the murder, not flamboyantly, not theatrically, but with the same quiet precision with which she had served tea, folded linen, and wiped Edmund's muddy boots for 30 years. Miss Marple folded her hands over her knitting and sighed. It was always the small things, she thought, the change in a lipstick shade, the absence of a tray, the smell of almonds. They were whispers, really, nothing more. But to someone who listened well enough, they were screams. It was the kind of late afternoon tea for which English village tradition was built. Neatly arranged sponge cake, a lace cloth, and an unspoken tension that lingered like steam above the teacups. Miss Marple had asked Vivian Latimer if she might host a few of the concerned parties for a final moment of remembrance. Vivian, though still brittle with grief, or what passed for it, had agreed. Thus assembled in the drawing-room of Fernley were Margaret Denby, pale and tightly wound, Charles Denby, seated stiffly with a barely concealed scowl, Dr. Lionel Greaves, uncharacteristically silent, Vivian, cool and withdrawn, and standing slightly apart, Eliza Crowthorne, her posture impeccable, her expression unreadable. Miss Marple poured tea with quiet efficiency, making small talk about chrysanthemums and the changing weather. It was only once everyone had taken a second scone that she folded her hands and looked gently around the room. "You know," she said, "I've always thought that the truth has a peculiar way of revealing itself, not with a trumpet, but with a whisper, and sometimes it's found in the smallest things." She paused, letting her words settle like fine sugar into strong tea. "I believe we were all mistaken about Edmund's death." Dr. Greaves frowned. "You can't possibly mean—" "Oh, but I can," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "Because, you see, Edmund didn't die of heart failure, nor did he die from any malady that could be listed on a tidy certificate. He died of cyanide poisoning. A silence fell over the room. It was not gasping or dramatic, just the sort of cold hush that accompanies an uninvited truth. And Miss Marple, calm as ever, reached for her cup and added just the faintest touch of lemon. "Of course," Miss Marple continued, "we must ask ourselves how such a poison could have entered his system. There were no signs of struggle, no suggestion of ingestion beyond the brandy beside him." She looked directly at Dr. Greaves, whose mouth opened, then closed again. "You saw the glass, Doctor, and you assumed he had consumed what it contained. But the glass was clean. There was no trace of the poison. Not in the decanter, not in the supposed drink." Charles Denby shifted in his chair. "So what are you implying?" "That the scene was staged," Miss Marple replied gently. "After his death, someone found him, realized how he had died, or perhaps how he would be found, and deliberately replaced the original glass, the one that did contain poison." She turned her gaze to Eliza. "The brandy was poured, poisoned, and left. But Edmund never had time to drink it. He died before the first sip, and someone very clever, saw an opportunity to mask that truth." Vivian spoke for the first time, voice thin. "But why go to such lengths?" "Because the truth might have pointed to a person no one would ever suspect, someone in the background, someone relied upon, overlooked, and quietly discarded." Eliza's hands folded neatly in her lap, remained still. "But of course," Miss Marple added, "not everything could be erased. One small item was overlooked, or rather, deliberately hidden." She leaned forward, her voice still soft. "The tray, and the glass it carried." From the basket at her side, Miss Marple produced a small parcel wrapped in linen. She placed it on the table and unfolded it with the care of someone revealing a treasured heirloom. Inside lay the original valet tray, and resting upon it, the crystal brandy glass, the one never meant to be seen again. There was a moment of stunned silence. "I found these," she said simply, "tucked behind the rose trellis. Quite neatly, I might add. Just far enough to delay discovery, but not so far as to be lost forever." She gestured toward the glass. "This, I believe, is the glass that Edmund Latimer poured for himself on the night of his death, the one that contained poison, and on its rim," she pointed delicately, "is a faint smear of lipstick, not coral, as Margaret wears, not any modern shade, but rather a deeper red, a shade I've seen only recently." Her eyes found Eliza. "You wore it to church 2 Sundays ago, a surprise given your usual preference for no cosmetics at all." Margaret exhaled sharply, as if a fog had cleared. "But that's absurd. Eliza wouldn't—" "Eliza," Miss Marple said gently, "was the only person with both the knowledge and the opportunity. She had access to the study, to the tray, to the drink, and most importantly, she had the reason. After decades of faithful service, she had been told, in no uncertain terms, that she was no longer needed." Eliza's lips pressed into a thin line. Her eyes, dark and watchful, betrayed neither denial nor guilt, only wariness, the kind born not from crime but from being forgotten. Miss Marple's voice did not rise, nor did her tone sharpen. If anything, it softened, as one might speak to a child who has broken something precious and does not yet understand the weight of it. "Eliza," she said gently, "was not only housekeeper here. She was the constant thread. She served your parents, Vivian. She knew Edmund as a boy. She cared for him during fevers, bruises, and tantrums. And through the years, through changes and disappointments, she remained. Her eyes turned to the others, who sat in varying states of disbelief. When Mrs. Latimer died, it was Eliza who held the household together. When Edmund returned and began altering everything, guests, parties, debts, she endured it all, because she believed in her way that she still mattered here. Miss Marple looked directly at Eliza, her voice quieter now. "But then he told you, didn't he? About selling Fernley, about the new plans, the modern couple who were going to run things efficiently and bring in their own staff. You would be given a small pension and helped into a home." Eliza didn't move. "He didn't say it cruelly, I imagine. Men like Edmund rarely think their selfishness needs apology. But for you, it was the final insult. After giving your life to this house, you were to be dismissed with a pat on the head." A log cracked in the fireplace. "And so," Miss Marple concluded softly, "you made a decision, not in rage but in resolve. If Edmund no longer valued Fernley, he would not be allowed to keep it." And with that, Miss Marple folded her hands neatly, as if to say, the truth at last had been laid bare. Eliza Crowthorne sat very still. Her eyes did not blink, her hands did not tremble. But something subtle, some flicker beneath the skin, changed. She looked at the tray on the table, at the glass she had touched, at the smear of her own lipstick, like a bloodstain on crystal. Her voice, when it came, was low, unwavering. "I waited until he was alone," she said. "He always poured his own drink. I watched from the hallway. He never saw me." No one interrupted. The only sound was the faint tick of the long case clock in the corner. "I'd put the bottle back in the drawer. I kept it for years, just in case." Her gaze flicked to Miss Marple. "You're quite right. I didn't hate him. Not at first. I hated what he became, what he did to this place, to all of us." She exhaled slowly, as though setting something heavy down. "I meant it to be clean, quick. I thought it would feel like justice. But it didn't. Not really. Just empty." Margaret made a small sound, half shock, half sorrow. Charles looked away, jaw clenched. Vivian sat rigid, eyes wide, as though unable to reconcile betrayal with the orderly woman who had once tied her hair ribbons. "I didn't want to be forgotten," Eliza said. "He thought he could discard me like an old glove. But I taught him respect in the end." She stood then, straight and dignified. Miss Marple did not gloat. She only nodded once, gently. Because this too she understood, that the most dangerous hearts are not always the loudest, but the ones most quietly broken. They came for Eliza Crowthorne in the early hours of the following morning. There was no drama, no struggle. Just Inspector Cray, in his polished boots and a respectfully lowered voice, accompanied by a quiet constable. Eliza stood at the threshold of Fernley's front door, her hands folded neatly before her, her expression calm. "I won't fuss," she said, as if she were merely stepping out to post a letter. "But I'd like a moment, just to see the drawing room again." Permission was granted. She walked slowly through the house, her house as she had long seen it, not touching anything, but letting her eyes rest on familiar details. The clock on the mantelpiece, the portrait of Mrs. Latimer, the bowl of dried lavender by the staircase. Then she nodded once and went with them. In the village, the news spread with both sorrow and disbelief. Some refused to believe it at all. "Eliza," they said, "never." Others, less certain, simply looked down and murmured, "You never know what goes on behind closed doors." Miss Marple said very little. She understood that justice did not always come with satisfaction. Sometimes it came with regret. Sometimes it came quietly. And sometimes it wore a red lipstick that no one had ever expected to see. Vivian Latimer remained at Fernley. There was no grand announcement, no sweeping reforms. But slowly, subtly, changes were made. The great drawing room, once cold and formal, found itself warmed by fresh roses each week. The long unused east wing was opened to house local widows displaced by rising rents. The pantry was stocked with simpler fare, and the servants, those who remained, spoke of a different tone in the household. Vivian never discussed her brother publicly again. She did not defend him, nor did she condemn him. But those who knew her best noticed something had shifted. The bitterness that had once clung to her voice like soot had begun to lift. She spoke more gently, more often. She was seen walking the village lanes in the late afternoons, no longer avoiding eye contact and occasionally stopping to chat with the grocer's wife. And when asked, rarely but curiously, about Miss Marple, she said only, "She sees more than anyone ought to, and she tells less than anyone dares." In her own way, Vivian had inherited more than property. She had inherited perspective. Margaret and Charles Denby departed St. Mary Mead, under the veil of discretion, their luggage loaded into the estate car before most villagers were awake. There was no farewell gathering, no note left with the vicar, no last stroll past the orchard. Only a closed door, a set of drawn curtains and silence. The whispers followed them, of course. Some said Margaret had known more than she let on. Others claimed Charles had seen the poisoned glass and said nothing, afraid of where the truth might lead. No one knew for certain, but that had never stopped a village from speculating. Their absence, however, left no hole. St. Mary Mead was used to such vanishings, used to couples who arrived with promise and departed with rumor. But Miss Marple noted with quiet sadness how often guilt came not from action, but from inaction. Margaret had loved Edmund once, perhaps. Or perhaps she had simply loved the memory of being loved. And Charles had lived in the shadow of a man whose death brought not triumph, but shame. Their marriage would go on perhaps, or end quietly, in another village, among strangers who did not ask questions. Either way, they were no longer part of the pattern Miss Marple had so carefully unpicked. Dr. Lionel Greaves was not a man given to apologies, but he made one, to Miss Marple, and then, in private, to Vivian. He acknowledged the error, the haste, the professional arrogance that had nearly allowed a murder to pass unremarked, and he did more than apologize. He acted. Within the month, he had arranged for a second doctor to be stationed part-time at the village clinic. He began hosting monthly health lectures at the church hall. He listened more and spoke less. It did not erase the mistake, but it mended the trust. Miss Marple, when asked, remarked that she had always believed in second chances, especially for men who had learned that silence was not always wisdom. And Dr. Greaves, for the first time in years, began to look people in the eye without flinching. A week later, Miss Marple sat with Mrs. Hartnell in the garden, enjoying a cup of Darjeeling and the faint scent of honeysuckle in the breeze. "It's a strange world," Mrs. Hartnell said, buttering a scone. "Who would have thought it was Eliza all along?" Miss Marple stirred her tea. "People think murder comes in storms," she said. "But more often it comes in whispers, in overlooked glances, forgotten kindnesses, and the breaking of something that once felt safe." Mrs. Hartnell blinked. You do have a dramatic turn of phrase, Jane. Miss Marple smiled. I've simply lived long enough to know that most truths aren't shouted. They're whispered. And the trouble is, no one listens anymore. She picked up her cup and took a sip. But sometimes, she added almost to herself, when you know what to listen for, a misplaced tray, a changed lipstick, a boy's casual remark, the truth becomes quite loud indeed. And with that, they returned to their tea and roses and gentle village peace. The mystery was over. But for Miss Marple, the pattern of life and the quiet truths hidden in plain sight would always remain. In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, where roses bloom and teacups clink, it's easy to forget that even the most peaceful places can hide deep heartbreak. This wasn't just a murder mystery. It was a story about loyalty betrayed, about years of silent service discarded in the blink of a selfish decision. Eliza Crowthorne wasn't a villain in the traditional sense. She was a woman forgotten, overlooked, and finally pushed past her limit. And in her quiet defiance, the lipstick, the hidden tray, the staged scene, we saw a tragic portrait of someone whose value had been measured only until she was no longer needed. Miss Marple, with her usual grace and piercing insight, reminded us that truth doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers, through a boy's innocent remark, a misplaced glass. And that concludes today's journey into the shadows of mystery and deduction. What did you think of this case? Did you see the twist coming, or did it catch you by surprise? Share your theories and favorite moments in the comments below. Love to hear your take. And if you're craving more thrilling detective tales, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss the next mystery. Until then, stay curious. The next clue might be closer than you think it.